We're going to resume our meeting. Merci tout le monde d'être ici. Merci à
Thanks for being here. Thank you to all of our witnesses for attending.
expert witnesses today. And this is the second of 3 meetings that we're going to be having on the situation in Tigray. We'll be having 5 minutes introductory remarks for our witnesses. While you're speaking, please, if you like to see how much time you have, I'll put up my hand at 1 like this, and when I go like this, it's like really close to the end, and then I'll just cut you off after we hit 5. So we have today with us Dr. Heilam Kebide Mekonnen, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Maryland, and also Maître Sarah Teach from the United Tigray, Canada. She's an international human rights lawyer joining us today also. We're going to start off with Dr. Mekonnen for 5 minutes, please, for your opening remarks.
Okay, thank you very much for giving me a chance. So before I came to the United States, during the war, I was in Tigray. So I was an academic dean for the University Hospital, Eider, in Tigray, Mekelle. And I witnessed all the atrocities happening during the war as a CEO of the University Hospital. So today, I will only mention few of the cases of sexual harassment and abuses happen in the girls and women, which I was overseeing, and all these girls and women to take from our hospital to the safe house downtown in the city. So I will only mention a few of the cases. The first case, just reporting, I'm sorry if some of the words are a bit disturbing, so I'm just asking ahead an apology if somebody is making this. So the first one is a 65-year-old lady which came from our hospital, and she was presented with a complaint of gang rape, and she was raped both anally and vaginally by 5 Eritrean troops. And she was also beaten by stick. And on her examination, she had bruise in her back and her side, and she develops a 2nd-degree perianal tear. And the other is a 6-year-old child, a girl. She was presented to our hospital, and she was raped by the military in area called Hausen, and in front of her mother and father. And upon examination, she develops a full-blown psychiatric problem, and she admitted to the psychiatric ward. And a 21 years old, which is a para, which is only have a son and her first month of postpartum after pregnancy, and she is a lactating mother. She was abducted by Ethiopian military and Eritrean military from the outskirts of Mekelle, and she was raped for 2 weeks by 12 assailants, and she has been weakened, and finally her husband was again abducted, and he was asked a ransom to get her release his wife, and he paid 5,000 Ethiopian birr to get her release after she had been sexual slavery for 2 weeks in a camp of the Ethiopian military. And the other one is 33 years old. She was, before the war, she was in a drug, in antiretroviral drug, and then the assailtant came and they tried to rape her. She told them that she is HIV positive, and they said they are okay with it because they want the virus to disseminate all Tigrayan girls and women so that it will help them, and they raped her, and with 4 of them, and finally you can imagine how they are also transmitting the HIV virus to all the girls and women that are going to rape. So she was finally have problem of rectal prolapse because they also abuse her anally, and she has also psychiatric problem, and she was also admitted to the psychiatric ward because she was completely mentally loose. And the other one is 19 years old. She was gang raped by all officers, by 10 combined forces. One is an Ethiopian, and the other is Eritrean, and the Amhara. She came from the western part of Tigray, and She has a multiple lacerations in perineum, and she have also developed what is called both orifices, anal and the vaginal orifices are combined, and that she is not in a position to contain her urine and feces. So she totally developed fistula. She cannot sit properly, and she is also HIV positive. She was also admitted to our hospital. And the other girl was 25 years old, and she came also from Adigrat, which is 120 kilometers from Mekelle, from the region. And then the Eritrean troops has gang raped her, and they put hot metal inside her body, and she was completely devastated, and her completely external and internal organs are damaged, and she was also come to our hospital. And then we cannot help her because she developed a very high destruction of her body, but she was also again developed a psychiatric problem, and she admitted to a psychiatric ward. And the other is two of our medical students, and have been taken up at night by the Ethiopian military, and they was raped. And then in the morning, I personally reported to the security apparatus in the region because medical students have been raped, and I was told to keep silent. And then these two girls and women, girls or medical students, the perpetrator was just in the street. They just move with impunity, and they didn't face justice. And the other one is a 52 years old, which is a para mother. Before the war, she was diagnosed with cervical cancer, but after it was raped by Eritrean troop, because it's in the border of Eritrea, she was raped, and then finally on the rape, then she broke up, the war broke out, and she was raped by two military Eritrean. She was brought to our hospital, and on an examination, she had vaginal bleeding from the fragile cervical and vaginal mass, and she also developed an offensive foul smellings. And the other girl came also to our hospital, and she was gang raped, and inside her body, they inserted condom, and they inserted some soft tissue to protect the bleeding. And then they inserted, and she was also came from our hospital, and our gynecology obstetrician removed all this stuff from her body, and she was also admitted to the psychiatry. So one of the most important parts in this case that we diagnosed was 553. This was before I left. I left Tigray or Ethiopia on April 2021. Before I left, I have witnessed 553 rape cases who came to our hospital. And all these are raped either by Ethiopian troops or Eritrean and Amhara militia. And then there is also
Thank you, Dr. Mekonnen. If you can just give very concluding statement to your initial 5 minutes, you'll have more time to continue to elaborate on this.
Okay, thank you very much. So my conclusion is this all rape is not just an incident. It is a systematic campaign to subjugate the whole society so that they will understand in a fear, or they live in a fear and in a panic to be submissive for the central government. So in my view, all this is mounts to a genocidal of sexual slavery, what was happening in Tigray. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing those powerful truths with us. We're now going to move to Maître Teach. Please, you have 5 minutes, and I invite you to keep an eye on the screen.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to speak today on behalf of United Tigray Canada. It has been almost 2 years since the start of the conflict, and evidence has mounted of atrocity crimes and human rights abuses committed by Ethiopian and Eritrean forces against Tigrayans. There's evidence of sexual and gender-based violence, forced displacement, mass killings, and cultural destructions in what Human Rights Watch has described as a campaign of ethnic cleansing targeting Tigrayans. Humanitarian access and aid has been blocked, there's also emerging evidence of genocide, and this is the crime on which I will focus the bulk of my oral submissions. Genocide is defined in the UN Genocide Convention and in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The definition is identical in each instrument. Genocide occurs when any one of 5 underlying acts is committed with an intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. The 5 underlying acts are killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. In Tigray, there is growing evidence of genocide. At the least, there is evidence of a serious risk of genocide, which is enough to obligate Canada to act to prevent it, pursuant to Canada's own international legal obligations as a state party to the Genocide Convention. First, and this relates to the first of the 5 underlying acts, there is substantial evidence that Tigrayans are being killed. Mass killings of Tigrayan civilians has permeated this conflict since November 2020, when hundreds of Tigrayans were massacred in Aksum. There were also killings in Humera and Mekelle. The UN International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia, in its report last month, documented that Ethiopian and allied forces are increasingly engaged in airstrikes, indiscriminately killing and injuring Tigrayan civilians. There is also substantial evidence that serious bodily and mental harm are being committed against Tigrayans, and that conditions of life, including famine and the denial of humanitarian access, are being inflicted. These relate to the 2nd and 3rd underlying acts in the Genocide Convention, respectively. The UN International Commission concluded that there are reasonable grounds to believe that Ethiopian and allied forces, quote, implemented a widespread range of measures designed to systematically deprive the population of Tigray of material and services indispensable for its survival, end quote. In other words, famine is being used as a weapon of war. The requisite intent to destroy a group is often the hardest to prove, but in Tigray, there is mounting evidence of intent to destroy Tigrayans as a group. Reporting by Human Rights Watch found sexual violence to be a defining feature of the conflict, and evidence of genocidal intent is evident from the testimony. For example, one 30-year-old survivor shared that as she was raped by 4 men, they said to her, quote, "You and your race are a foul, toilet-smelling race and should not be on our land," end quote. The UN International Commission found that Tigrayan women and girls are targeted with particular violence and brutality, and that attackers use dehumanizing language suggestive of an intent to destroy the Tigrayan ethnicity. One Tigrayan woman was told after she was gang raped that, quote, "Our problem is with your womb, and a Tigrayan womb should never give birth." Genocidal intent is also indicated by the indiscriminate targeting of civilians, and by repopulation of Tigrayan areas in keeping with a governmental policy to change the ethnic character of the region. We have heard earlier this morning about dehumanizing hate speech. All this is indicative of an intent to destroy, in whole or in part, the Tigrayan people. This evidence of an intent to destroy, when paired with at least one of the 5 underlying acts, is indicative of genocide. At the least, the evidence documented so far in this conflict denotes a serious risk of genocide, which is enough under the law that Canada is obliged to act. The next question becomes how Canada should act. Our fulsome recommendations to that effect are included in UTC's most recent brief, which is dated October 2022, which I am told you will receive next week. Among other things, Canada should impose targeted sanctions on Ethiopian and Eritrean officials responsible, engage in criminal prosecutions using our universal jurisdiction laws, and resettle Tigrayan refugees, including the 65,000 plus that are presently in Sudan. I will leave it there for now, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Merci, Teach, for that. We're now going to continue on to our first round of questioners. I'm going to give 5 minutes per questioner in the first round and 2 minutes to the second round. We're going to start off with Mr. Verson for 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here. There's a recurring theme coming up here that we should recognize the genocide in. We should make a report that would suggest that the government recognize, the Canadian government recognize the genocide that's happening in the Tigray region. How do we do that without participating in the political realities that are happening in Ethiopia? That's going to be the challenge, I think. So I'll. I forgot your names here now, but someone jump in.
The questioners, unless you want to direct them specifically to either.
I'd like to hear both of them.
Perfect.
Actually.
I guess I'll jump into that first. When it comes to recognition of genocide and the political aspects, I would encourage this committee to approach genocide with the legal test, because at the end of the day, genocide is a crime with a very precise legal definition. And if that definition fits, there's value in, as we heard earlier this morning, calling a spade a spade. Among other things, it's a clear recognition that Canada is obliged to act to prevent genocide under the Genocide Convention.
Just to respond to that a little bit, what my concern is that if Canada recognizes the genocide and the reaction, I don't like to throw the word around quickly because, but when we do, then we should do something about it. And so if a government is participating in genocide, any aid that we're giving that government should cease immediately. And you'd probably agree with that. That is then putting our thumb on the scales dramatically in this political conflict that is happening, but like there is interests from the Tigrayans for that to happen. How do we balance that? How do we balance that political? With, say we recognize it, but then how do we balance it so that the Tigrayans don't turn around and start attacking in the other direction, essentially?
Right. I mean, that's a good question. I think the key is that, and someone mentioned this earlier in the first panel, is we don't want to appease current leadership for fear of something that may happen in the future. And I would also note that in terms of imposing, in terms of Canada's obligation to act, even if we don't go ahead and even if the government doesn't call it genocide, the government of Canada, in my opinion, would still be obligated to take certain actions to prevent it, because the obligations don't just arise when Canada calls it a genocide. The obligations actually arise as soon as a state party to the Genocide Convention knows or should know that there is a serious risk of genocide. And that's from the International Court of Justice case in 2007, Serbia and Bosnia. So in terms of effect, I'm not sure that takes anything away from that. And on the flip side, if Canada does recognize the genocide and then the TPLF goes ahead and commits its own atrocity crimes, nothing would be stopping Canada from recognizing those atrocity crimes at that point. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Like it's not the atrocity. It's a political conflict that we're having, and each side is accusing the others of atrocities. And I don't doubt that they're happening. It's just how do we isolate the human rights from the political? Is essentially. I'd like to hear from the doctor on this.
Yeah, I think I echo her response, but in my view, Canada should stand by her own moral obligation. So that's the bottom line. And we should not, in my view, Canada should not just move to appeal or an appeasement for the government or for the Tigrayan, but they just have to stand on their own moral obligation so that they can move in any way. So it's what matters is not political. What matters is human right violation, in my view. I know human rights may coined with political or ideological view, but at least in Canada, and the interest is more on human rights. So that can be can be just go when they stand with their moral obligation. Is it really happening? Or is this not really happening? So if it is really happening, and then they should go and say something. They have to make, I believe, they have a very good leverage on the government or the central government of Addis. So they have to use all the leverage, what they have in their hand. But so far, Canada was really quite reluctant to go ahead or to face the government of Addis. And in this human right, even in statements, in some of the measures that other Western country has tried to make. So it's what matters. It's moral. It's not about human rights.
Thank you, Dr. Mekonnen. We're going to continue on to our second questioner, Mr. Sidhu, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first of all, thank you to the witnesses for taking the time to be with us here this morning, on this Friday morning. Dr. Mekonnen, thank you for your continued strength and to share those gruesome and horrifying experiences. I definitely know that we're greatly concerned by the ongoing reports of human rights abuses and obstruction of humanitarian access. And I also understand the government of Canada has provided roughly $40 million for humanitarian funding to help support those most in need in Ethiopia. And just hearing from you firsthand and the stories, and given your experience and insights, I'd really like to hear more about if you can speak to the ongoing work at the regional level to find a peaceful solution to the situation.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think what we have to do is the regional African Union was, in my view, has no much guarantee for the peace going. But in any way, if we have to stick on that, so the international actors like Canada, European Union, and United States may have involved as international or multilateral involvement, so that this peace has to come at least in any way in a very short time. So in this case, the Canadian what can do is they have to pressurize the government to at least immediately declare a cessation of hostility. And in that case, and if there is cessation of hostility declared, and then the Tigrayan has to be also pressurized to abide or to accept that cessation of hostility. So before we go, because there is a very aggressive war going on now, and many people distraction is so. Before the war, before November 2020, Tigray, especially in the health sector, was a model in the other part of the region. But now, more than 70% was distracted. So what is left is now again distracted, and what is left is the civilian population, and again get killed and raped. So the first things now the Canadian can do is just pressurize the government at the moment so that cessation of hostility can be declared immediately. And then this can be also, again, accepted by the Tigrayan or by the Tigrayan government or regional government. So this African Union by itself alone, I'm not sure that it can solve the problem, because African Union is very close to the Addis regime, so that the other side or the other actor is usually complaining that it cannot solve the problem by itself. It needs Canadian and other Western countries to be involved.
Thank you. And Ms. Titch, I'd like to kind of hear your views as well.
Yes, I would echo what the doctor said. The African Union has ceased to become really a feasible option. I would note that in the Human Rights Watch report, they suggested a Security Council-led arms embargo. So that's an option, using other more international multilateral institutions. And I read just last night that the Security Council intends to meet on this issue shortly. So that could be an option.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I know in November last year, Minister Joly, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, spoke with His Excellency Moussa Faki Mohammed, Chairman of the African Union Commission, And during that conversation, Minister Joly emphasized Canada's, of course, profound alarm regarding the rapidly deteriorating situation in Tigray. Moreover, Minister Joly reiterated how essential it is to work towards a political solution and, of course, an inclusive national dialogue in order to ensure a peaceful resolution of the conflict. I've got less than a minute left, but can you speak to maybe the latest developments on this political situation? I know you kind of did it in your opening remarks, but if you can take some time now to kind of express more on that. Ms. Teach.
I'm sorry, I didn't know that was directed to me. Right, so I think the issue with political solutions and negotiations, there's actually one point I'd like to raise in my very short time, and that's the involvement of Eritrea in this process. I understand that at one point Eritrea was invited to the negotiating table, and in my view, and in United Tigray Canada's view, that legitimizes inappropriately the role of Eritrea on the ground.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Sidhu, and exactly within 5 minutes, masterfully done. Mr. Brunel Duceppe, please, for 5 minutes. Pour 5 minutes.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much to our witnesses for being with us in this study, which is of key importance, especially for the Tigrayan community in Canada, and they are putting pressure on us so that this government takes action, finally. During the first panel, we heard about a lot of the proof, a lot of the evidence that is there, and Mr. McConnon also referred to multiple cases, and he's underlining that there's a genocide taking place in the Tigray right now. But I'd like to ask a question to Ms. Teach. I admire her work on many topics, by the way. So what is then the difference between ethnic cleansing and the genocide? It might not be very clear for everyone, especially if they're not experts, as you are. So would you please kindly explain the difference to us between the two?
A great question, and gladly. Genocide is an international crime. It's an atrocity crime that's defined very clearly in the Genocide Convention and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And I've already gone through that definition in my opening remarks, so I won't repeat it. Ethnic cleansing, on the other hand, is not an atrocity crime that's under the jurisdiction of the Rome Statute of the ICC. Its definition can, though, be gleaned from a UN commission of experts that was tasked with looking into crimes committed in the former Yugoslavia. That commission defined ethnic cleansing as rendering an area ethnically homogenous by using force or intimidation to remove persons of given groups from the area. That same commission, in its final report, defined ethnic cleansing as a purposeful policy designed by one ethnic or religious group to remove by violent and terror-inspiring means the civilian population of another ethnic or religious group from certain geographic areas. I know those two sentences are a bit of a mouthful, but essentially that's what ethnic cleansing is. And ethnic cleansing in the context of Tigray has been alleged and supported with evidence already by the likes of Human Rights Watch. It was also the subject of an internal US government report, which found that Ethiopian officials deliberately and efficiently are rendering Western Tigray ethnically homogenous through forced displacement and then repopulation of the regions.
Merci.
Thank you so much. You spoke about the risk of genocide, or genocide that is currently going on, rather. But when there's risk of genocide and when there is active genocide happening, so Canada is under the same obligations at the international level, if I understand this correctly, whether it's a risk or an ongoing genocide. Do I get this right?
Yes, that's right. Under the Genocide Convention, states parties to the convention have an obligation to prevent genocide. Canada is a state party to the Genocide Convention, as is, interestingly enough, Ethiopia. But then in this case of Bosnia and Serbia that came out of the ICJ in 2007, the court clarified that that obligation doesn't arise when there's a full-scale genocide. It actually arises when there's a serious risk of genocide, which makes sense because if the obligation is to prevent, you can't, preventing a genocide that's already happening seems a little bit like it defeats the purpose of the convention.
So these obligations, we understand them, but in the text of the Genocide Convention that was signed, preventing or punishing means of achieving these are not necessarily included in the convention. So when it comes to Canada's obligations following its signature of this document, what would be the means to either prevent or punish this genocide or genocide risk?
Great question. That's right. The Genocide Convention does not outline specific actions. Essentially, Canada should really just be using all the tools available at its disposal to prevent genocide. So that can include targeted sanctions against Ethiopian and Eritrean forces for responsibility, including command responsibility for the genocide. So anyone who's at the top and ordering it or failing to punish it can also be sanctioned under our Magnitsky laws or Special Economic Measures Act. We can also use criminal prosecutions and also using like aid, removal of aid. There are definitely different levers that Canada can pull. There are also Canadian businesses in the region that could be encouraged to comply with their own human rights obligations. I think I've run out of time, right?
15 seconds.
It's a very long question.
Thank you so much.
And we're going to continue to our last question of this first round. We'll have a second round. Ms. McPherson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to thank the witnesses for being here today. That testimony was incredibly difficult to hear. I imagine that everyone in this room has been yeah, our hearts go with you as we hear that testimony, certainly. You know, and it isn't new testimony, unfortunately. We have been hearing from the Tigrayan community, from humanitarian organizations, that this has been happening for such a long time. You know, we heard from the chief of the World Health Organization in March, and I quote, that the situation in Tigray is affecting the health of millions of people, and there is nowhere on earth that it is worse than what is happening in Tigray. So you know, when we hear these stories of rape as a weapon of war, you know, the attack on the weaponization of the attack of civilians, child soldiers, the failure to provide humanitarian access, I am struck by the fact that Canada has a feminist international assistance policy and are supposed to have a feminist foreign policy, and that those two pieces mean that Canada must play a bigger role in this. I'm also struck by the similarities in what we're hearing with regards to the language, with regards to the actions that we're hearing to the genocide that did happen in Rwanda, and Canada's declaration that we would not let that happen again. So I would like to hear, first of all, you know, how, Ms. Teach, perhaps I'll start with you, but how do you see this as being similar to what we saw in Rwanda? Is there a role for Canadian peacekeepers, for example? Is there a role for Canada to play there? If you could reflect on that, please.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. I do see a lot of similarities with Rwanda as well. And as far as peacekeeping forces, I think Canadian involvement is a great idea, is particularly because of the failures of the African Union. It's, as we've heard already, its proximity to the Ethiopian government. And, you know, to use another quote from the WHO chief, I actually don't have the particular quote in front of me, but he said something to the effect of, there's a narrow window now to prevent a genocide. And I think that's really striking, is that we should really be getting on the ground of this now. There's really no time to waste. And I agree with everything you've said.
Thank you. And I would also just ask for both of you perhaps to comment on the fact, you know, we did hear in the last panel that there is risk to declaring this genocide, in that it will cause escalation. It will inflame a very, very difficult regionally political situation. However, we've also heard that the failure of the international community to step up, to raise the issues of what are happening in Tigray has given some impunity. You know, our appeasement has resulted in impunity by the Ethiopian government and Eritrean forces to continue to take this on. Perhaps both of you could comment on that and your thoughts on Canada declaring this as a genocide.
Yeah, I think the Canadian and international community, the failure, has emboldened both Eritrean and Ethiopian government. So by declaring these atrocities, I don't think that there will be an aggressive or things may not be aggravated back, because once they know, and then they will not live with impunity. And once they know, they face justice, so that they can even come to the terms, so that they can make a little bit negotiation. So Canada, in my view, has a very good leverage on the central government of Addis. But so far, Canada, in my view, do not use that leverage, because the leverage will help the government to back its track, and then to at least reduce the civilian atrocities. He can fight with the military, but the civilian atrocities and the rape, and also the government by itself has invited an Eritrean, a foreign country, to decimate all its own population. So Canada has also relation with an Eritrea. So they could not have been do much better for the Eritrean government or the Ethiopian government, so that these two will, at least they will understand that they will not left with impunity, and they will face justice if this continue. So Canada has a very, or can just do a very central role now when this African Union-led initiatives coming, because as we mentioned before, African Union by itself alone cannot solve this very complicated matter. So it needs like country like Canada, United States, and others who have a very good stock on the central government. So by declaring genocide, I don't think that things will be aggravated on the ground.
Thank you, Dr. Mekonnen. We are now going to continue to our final round, each for 2 minutes, and I just ask you to keep your clocks on and keep an eye on me personally. I'll give timing. With our first questioner, Mr. Assassi, for 2 minutes. Not on. We'll give it a few moments. He's right here, Mr. Assassi. We can see you, and you're on mute.
Apologies, I thought it was the Conservative member who got to go first. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our two witnesses. My first question was, we know that Canada has provided $45 million of assistance. Is there any evidence that this assistance is helping individuals in the most affected areas of Ethiopia? Has it arrived?
Yeah, I think if the question is for me, we are not sure, because there is no, for instance, in Tigray, there are sexual abuse survivors. They couldn't get any support. And they are still just left at limbo without any medical supplies and also some hygiene materials. So I'm not sure if the Canadian generosity has reached to the poor in the other end. That I'm not sure. So I think it's up to the Canadian government to ask whether these girls and women, for instance, has been get a supply or some helps or assistance from the generous, the people of Canada and the government of Canada.
Fair enough. Thank you for that. Now, Ms. Teach, if I could go to you, is there any member of the international community that has declared genocide to be occurring in Ethiopia right now?
Not to my knowledge, but we have seen a serious risk of genocide as a term be used by, for example, the WHO chief recently.
Thank you very much. I believe I'm out of time.
30 seconds.
30 seconds. Okay. If you, Ms. Teach, if you could talk about the significance of the new UN report that came out on September 21st, because you referenced it, but if you could elaborate.
Sure. That report documented some substantial evidence that relates to various prongs of genocide. It also clears up some of the competing narratives that we were seeing on the ground by, for example, placing the blame squarely at the feet of the Ethiopian and allied governments for denial of humanitarian assistance.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. And we'll continue to our second round. Mr. Abu Tayyaf.
Thank you. Ms. Teach, the question is, it seems like we're into an impossible situation here. And what do you think, or why do you think it's difficult to motivate people to take action with this situation?
To answer a little bit bluntly, it seems to always be a little bit difficult to motivate when we're dealing with Africa. And it's really unfortunate, but it's a trend that we've seen over many, many years. And I think also there were competing narratives on the ground that were fueled by, among other things, a blockage of internet and cell communications. So what we saw was a proliferation of the Ethiopian government narrative and not much ability to counter that effectively. And to tie it back to this report that came out in September, the UN report, that's part of the reason that's so important, because it really did clear up some of those competing narratives.
If there's any single thing that Canada can do to influence in a way to ease this situation, what can that be?
One single way. I think one of the most important things, and the easiest in a sense, that Canada can do now is impose sanctions. And particularly, I want to focus on Eritrea, because Canada has a history with sanctions with Eritrea, as many of you will know. We had sanctions on Eritrea, which were then removed in, I can't recall if it was 2018 or 2020. Maybe it was 2018 that the Security Council removed them, in 2020 that Canada did, something like that. But reimposing sanctions on Eritrea for their involvement in atrocities, imposing sanctions on Ethiopian officials for their involvement in the atrocities is something very tangible that Canada can do straight away.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. And next, our next questioner will be Mr. Brunel Duceppe, please, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you once again to our witnesses. This is the last time I'm taking the floor today, so you are going to be very helpful in terms of the report that we're going to prepare. So, Ms. Teach, I have been listening to you since the beginning of the panel. You are pointing to a particular issue. You're saying that it's always a bit more difficult when it's in Africa. Can you tell us what the difference is between Canada's reaction to the conflict in Ukraine, conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and Canada's reaction to what's happening in Tigray and in Ethiopia?
I'm sorry, the difference in reaction or the difference in perhaps motivation?
No.
The reaction, but if you want to talk about the motivation, you can do that too.
Sure. So when it comes to Ukraine, Canada has really pulled out all the stops. They have reacted very quickly. They've reacted in a number of ways. Bringing in Ukrainian refugees happened very quickly. That's something very tangible that we can and should apply to the Tigrayan refugees in Sudan. 65,000 plus, as I mentioned earlier, living under truly horrendous conditions. And in terms of maybe a brief note on motivation, I would say that, Canada, I can only guess really, but Canada shares a border with Russia, right? And so perhaps it's a little closer to home. But the Canadian interest in a secure and human rights complying African region is really important as well, and shouldn't be overlooked. And I think having a principled foreign policy approach means that we should be applying these principles wherever they occur, whether that's Ukraine, whether that's Ethiopia, whether it's China, what have you.
Thank you very much.
Merci, Madame Teach et Monsieur Brunel Duceppe.
Thank you, Ms. Teach and Mr. Brunel Duceppe. We will continue with Ms. McPherson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think all of us in this room and part of this committee are interested in finding ways that Canada can play a meaningful role. Raising this in this committee, I think, is one of those steps. Of course, you've given us some very good indications with regards to immigration, with regards to sanctions, with regards to playing that role in peaceful negotiations. But I am going to go back to two things that I don't think we've touched on quite enough. Canada did make a commitment, the Prime Minister made a commitment in 2017 to have more peacekeepers in the field. We have not met that commitment. We haven't even come close. And also, you talked about the UAE fueling this conflict with arms that have been delivered. And we do know that Canada sells arms to the UAE, despite the fact that they are a massive human rights abuser. Ms. Teach, could you talk about peacekeeping and the provision of arms to the Eritrean government and whether Canada can play a better role in that?
Right. Yes, it's a really strong point that Canada has not met its obligations in terms of peacekeeping forces. I think that's a really interesting lever to pull, and one that maybe can be used to push the government of Canada to do so and meet this gap that's sort of caused by distrust in the AU. In terms of arms, there's the UAE, but then there's countries like Turkey, which Canada has a relationship with, which Canada can leverage in its bilateral, multilateral discussions. And the arms piece is really important as well. And on that note, I would suggest that we, as I think I mentioned earlier, that Canada support a Security Council-led arms embargo, which was one of the recommendations put forth by Human Rights Watch.
Thank you to everyone here, the witnesses, the questioners. That concludes our time for this panel. I want to thank Dr. Heolum Kebede McKinnon for being with us today and sharing such powerful accounts. It will certainly be duly noted, and our analysts have taken full note of that. And also Maître Sarah Teach for being here from United Tigray, Canada, international human rights lawyer. I want to thank you all. To all the members for being here. We're going to be getting back together next week, 8:45 a.m. On a personal note, I want to ask those in the committee, those caring about international human rights, to see a motion that I'll be presenting on Wednesday in the House of Commons at 5:30. I invite you to look at that. It's around the Uyghur and motion 62. We'll leave it at that. We'll be getting together next week at 9:30 a.m. 8:45 a.m. I hope everybody has a good and restful weekend. Thank you for being strong and for advocating for a better world and for human rights. Merci beaucoup. À la prochaine.
Thank you very much, and until next time.